The sea does not give up its dead easily, and sometimes it does not give them up at all. In the vast, sun-drenched expanse of the Caribbean, in an age of radar, radio, and presumed maritime mastery, a massive American ship, over 500 feet long and crewed by 39 experienced men, vanished without a trace, without a whisper, without a single cry for help. This is not a story from the age of sail, shrouded in the fog of superstition. This is a cold, hard, modern mystery. The year was 1963. The ship was the SS Marine Sulphur Queen, a converted World War II tanker, a workhorse of the post-war industrial boom. On February 2nd, she sailed from Beaumont, Texas, her holds filled with 15,260 tons of molten sulfur, heated to a searing 255 degrees Fahrenheit. Her destination, Norfolk, Virginia. A routine coastal run, a well-traveled path along the Gulf of Mexico and up the southeastern seaboard. The weather report was unremarkable. The crew was seasoned. The vessel, on paper, was sound. This was the placid, predictable normalcy of American commerce in the early 1960s. Yet within days, this normality would fracture into one of the most perplexing and chilling maritime disasters of the 20th century. A disappearance so complete it would force a reckoning with the very bones of the ships we trust to cross the deep. The SS Marine Sulphur Queen was, in essence, a patchwork giant, a product of expediency and economics. She began her life not as a specialized chemical carrier, but as a standard T2 tanker, the SS New Haven, built in the frantic wartime shipyards of 1944. In 1960, she was purchased by the Marine Transport Lines and underwent a radical, almost surgical conversion. Her original oil tanks were ripped out. In their place, workers installed 3 massive independent centerline cargo tanks, each capable of holding thousands of tons of molten sulfur. This was the flaw baked into her from the very start. The T2 design had a known and tragic weakness, a tendency for the hull to crack amidships, a fatal vulnerability that had doomed several of her sisters in the past. The conversion process, which involved cutting into the deck and hull to install the new tanks, would have concentrated immense stress on these already suspect structural members. But the economics were compelling. Sulfur was a vital commodity for fertilizer and chemicals, and shipping it molten was efficient. The ship was fitted with heating coils to keep the cargo fluid, a system that ran like a fever through her veins. Her master was Captain John G. Gamble, a 63-year-old veteran with 4 decades at sea. He was a steady, capable man, respected by his crew. The men under his command were a mix of young deckhands and old salts, men like Chief Engineer James Harwood, who knew the ship's grumbling machinery intimately. The final voyage began with the slow, meticulous process of loading the molten sulfur in Beaumont. As the golden, viscous liquid poured into the tanks, the entire hull would have groaned and expanded slightly from the heat, a metallic sigh that was part of the routine. They sailed south, into the Gulf, then rounded the Florida Keys into the Straits of Florida on February 3rd. The last known communication was a routine radio message received by a Coast Guard station in Miami at 1:25 a.m. on February 4th. The ship's position was given. She was about 20 miles west of Key West, in the deep, fast-moving channel of the Gulf Stream. The message was mundane, reporting an estimated arrival in Norfolk on the morning of February 7th. All was normal. But behind this facade of routine, the flaw was actively at work. The combination of the T2's fragile hull, the stress concentrations from the conversion, and the constant intense heat cycling from the cargo created a perfect storm of metallurgical fatigue. The steel in her midsection was not just under stress, it was being cooked, becoming brittle, losing its resilience. Every wave, every slight roll was a hammer blow on an anvil that was slowly cracking. Did Captain Gamble sense it? Were there subtle groans from the deep spaces of the ship that didn't sound right? Did the deck feel subtly different underfoot? We will never know. But the complacency was systemic. The ship had passed her inspections. She had made this run before. The assumption of safety, the trust in converted wartime technology, was the silent second flaw that sailed with them. They were on a ticking clock, in a ship that was molecule by molecule turning against them, steaming north through warm, dark waters under a blanket of stars, utterly alone. The end, when it came, was likely catastrophic and breathtakingly fast. It did not announce itself with a slow leak or a spreading fire. It was a sudden, violent divorce of steel from steel. Imagine the scene in those final moments. It is the deep night watch between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. on February 4th. The ship is riding the northward push of the Gulf Stream. The sea state is moderate, with swells but nothing alarming. For the men off watch, asleep in their bunks, the world is the familiar, comforting hum of engines and the gentle, rhythmic sway of the ship. For the men on the bridge and in the engine room, it is the monotony of the night shift, the glow of instruments, the scan of a dark horizon. Then, a sound. Not a loud bang, perhaps, but a deep, shuddering crack, a sound felt in the bones more than heard by the ears. The sound of the keel, the ship's backbone, finally succumbing to fatigue. It would have been a vibration that traveled the entire length of the hull, a metallic scream. In an instant, the careful equilibrium of the ship is shattered. The hull, critically compromised amidships, begins to buckle under the weight of 15,000 tons of liquid cargo. The sea, at a pressure of tons per square inch at that depth, immediately exploits the breach. Icy salt water floods into spaces adjacent to tanks holding material at 255 degrees. The result is a thermodynamic cataclysm. The contact between superheated sulfur and seawater is violent and explosive. The water flashes into steam with the force of a bomb, ripping open compartments. The molten sulfur itself, if exposed to the water, could solidify rapidly in chaotic, mountainous forms, creating uncontrollable shifting weights inside the hull. The ship is now being torn apart from the inside. Lights flicker and die as salt water shorts electrical systems. The engine's steady thrum is replaced by the deafening roar of inrushing water and the shriek of tearing metal. The deck heaves, twists, and begins to cant. Men are thrown from their bunks. In the pitch dark, with the floor now a steepening slope, there is chaos. The smell is horrific, the acrid tang of sulfur dioxide gas released from the cargo, mixing with the odor of salt spray and fear. On the bridge, Captain Gamble would have been thrown against the wheel. The rudder would be useless, the engine telegraph dead. In the span of perhaps 30 seconds, the ship's structural integrity is gone. She is breaking in two. The bow and stern sections, held together by deck plating and habit, begin to hinge upward as the midsection floods and collapses. The sea pours into the fracture. There is no time for a coordinated response, no time to reach lifeboats, which may already be twisted in their davits. The angle of list becomes a slide. The cold, black water of the Gulf Stream, miles deep here, rises to meet the deck. For the men in the engineering spaces, deep in the belly of the stern, there is likely no escape at all, just a sudden, overwhelming roar of water. For those on deck, the world becomes a nightmare of noise, darkness, choking fumes, and the terrifying, irresistible pull of a dying ship. The SS Marine Sulphur Queen, a vessel the length of 2 city blocks, is being swallowed. And in the overwhelming, rapid totality of this disaster, there is no time to reach the radio, to send an SOS. The final warning was the sound of the hull breaking itself apart. The distress call was the silence that followed. What followed the cataclysm was not an organized survival effort, but a fragmented, desperate, and likely brief struggle against impossible odds. The ship's breakup in the warm but strong current of the Gulf Stream would have been chaotic. Survivors, if any made it clear of the sinking hull, would have been scattered across a dark, heaving sea, possibly in the midst of a slick of solidifying sulfur and debris. The water temperature, while not frigid, was around 75 degrees Fahrenheit, survivable for a time but leading to hypothermia over hours. The real immediate killers were shock, injury, and the lack of any proper life-saving equipment readily at hand. We can only reconstruct the possibilities from known maritime tragedies and the scant evidence later found. Some men may have been flung into the water as the deck submerged. Others might have found themselves clinging to large pieces of wreckage, a hatch cover, a section of wooden decking, a floating cargo tank that had torn loose. The sulfur itself, now forming bizarre, porous yellow rafts as it cooled, could have provided temporary buoyancy, though its fumes would still be toxic. In the absolute darkness, the cries of men would have echoed across the water, quickly growing fewer as exhaustion, cold, and despair took hold. The psychological toll in those first minutes and hours would have been catastrophic. The mind cannot easily process such a rapid transition from the secure, illuminated world of a ship to the boundless black hostility of the open ocean. The disorientation is total. Which way is land? The ship is gone, leaving only a fading vortex of bubbles and noise. The current is pulling you north, away from the Florida Keys, into the deeper Atlantic. There are no lights on the horizon. The sheer, utter isolation of their situation would have been as crushing as the physical cold. Time becomes the enemy. Dawn would break hours later, offering the cruel mockery of visibility with no hope in sight. The Gulf Stream is a highway of water, not a shipping lane with constant traffic. A man in the water is virtually invisible from even a mile away. Dehydration under the tropical sun would compound the hypothermia from the night. Sharks, common in those waters, would have been drawn by the disturbance and the scent. The fight to survive, for those who initially made it into the water, would have been a slow, agonizing relinquishing of hope, a battle against the body's shutting down and the mind's surrender. It was a fight conducted in absolute silence, witnessed only by the sea and the sky. No mayday had been sent. No one was coming, because no one knew they were gone. The Coast Guard, the Navy, their own company, all believed the Marine Sulphur Queen was steaming peacefully toward Norfolk. The rescue mission would not begin for days, and when it did, it would not be a rescue at all, but a vast and haunting search for ghosts. The alarm was not raised until February 7th, when the Marine Sulphur Queen failed to arrive in Norfolk. What followed was one of the most extensive sea searches in peacetime history. The Coast Guard, Navy, and Air Force scoured over 348,000 square miles of ocean for 16 days. They found almost nothing of the ship, but what they did find was chilling and telling. On February 8th, a Coast Guard aircraft spotted a single life jacket, weathered and worn, floating in the Gulf Stream north of the Bahamas. It was not from the Sulphur Queen. It was an eerie coincidence, a placeholder for the emptiness they found. Then, more tangible clues emerged, a few shards of shattered life rafts, a name board from a ship's boat, a foghorn, a gasoline can, and, most significantly, a solitary life preserver ring stamped with the name Marine Sulphur Queen. These fragments were not found in a neat debris field, but scattered across hundreds of miles by the powerful, dispersive Gulf Stream. The official investigation by the Coast Guard and the Marine Board of Inquiry was a forensic puzzle with most of the pieces missing. Without a hull to examine, they had to rely on the physics of the disappearance, the history of the T2 tanker, and the nature of the cargo. The board's final report, released in 1963, was damning. It did not cite a single cause, but a cascading series of probable failures, centering on the asymmetric structural failure of the ship's hull. The conversion was highlighted as a critical factor. The cutting of large holes in the main deck to install the sulfur tanks created fatal stress points. The constant heating and cooling of the hull by the molten cargo induced thermal fatigue, making the already suspect steel of the wartime T2 hull brittle. The board concluded that the ship likely suffered a catastrophic fracture amidships, leading to a rapid breakup and sinking, so swift that no distress call was possible. The presence of sulfur dioxide gas, released if water contacted the cargo, could have incapacitated the crew, sealing their fate. The aftermath, however, is where this tragedy moved from mystery to legacy. The disappearance of the Marine Sulphur Queen was a profound shock to the maritime world. It was a stark, undeniable demonstration that the ocean's dangers had evolved alongside technology, and that human complacency and economic pressure could create new kinds of tombs. The disaster acted as a catalyst for sweeping, permanent changes. First, it sounded the final death knell for the remaining T2 tankers in commercial service. Their structural vulnerabilities could no longer be ignored. Second, and most importantly, it revolutionized the design and regulation of specialized cargo ships, particularly chemical and liquefied gas carriers. The concept of the double hull for tankers, which provides a protective space between the cargo and the sea, gained powerful advocacy. While not fully mandated until after the Exxon Valdez disaster in 1989, the Sulphur Queen was a critical early argument in its favor. New international regulations under the SOLS Convention were strengthened, demanding far more rigorous structural analysis for converted vessels, especially those carrying hazardous, heated cargoes. The inspection regime tightened, with a new focus on fatigue cracking and thermal stress. The Coast Guard's search and rescue protocols were also scrutinized, leading to improved ship reporting systems. In a very real sense, the 39 men lost with the Marine Sulphur Queen did not die in vain. Their silent, vanished ship became a ghost that haunted the drafting tables of naval architects and the halls of maritime regulators worldwide. It forced the industry to look beyond the rust and paint of a ship's hull and see the invisible forces of stress, fatigue, and chemistry at work. It was a hard, brutal lesson that true safety lies not in assuming a ship's strength, but in relentlessly questioning its every potential weakness. The survival hook here is not for the victims, they had no chance, but for the countless thousands of mariners who have sailed since in safer ships, their voyages underwritten by the stark, empty wake left behind in the Gulf Stream in February of 1963.
The sea keeps its secrets, but sometimes it leaves just enough evidence to point an accusatory finger. The ghost ship of the Pacific, the SS Marine Sulphur Queen, did not vanish into a supernatural void. It was swallowed by a perfect, man-made storm of flawed design, risky conversion, and systemic oversight. It stands as a monument, not to the mystery of the deep, but to the grave consequences of marrying volatile cargo to a fragile hull and of trusting routine in a realm that demands constant vigilance. The lesson is etched in steel and regulation. Complacency is the quietest, deadliest flaw of all. This tragedy exposed a failure in the visible machinery of transport. But what happens when the disaster is invisible from the start, when the very environment is poisoned by a silent, creeping toxicity, and the truth is buried not under miles of ocean, but under layers of state-sponsored lies and denial? For a catastrophe born not of the sea's fury, but of the arrogant rush of the atomic age, we must turn to the contaminated heart of the Cold War. In our next investigation, we journey to a closed Soviet city and a disaster so devastating it was hidden from the world for decades. The story of a nuclear catastrophe that dwarfed Chernobyl in its initial release, and the desperate, brutal cover-up that followed. This is the Soviet Union's darkest secret, the Kishtim disaster cover-up.